During the First Great War for Scottish independence, there lived a famous feudal lord and knight. This man was one of Scotland's chief commanders during the war, and earned himself many great names and titles. He was an early practitioner of psychological warfare, as well as a master of guerrilla tactics. He proved that fear on the battlefield could be more powerful than 1,000 men. Even now, it is hard to fully comprehend the abject horror that splintered through the mind of any Englishman who heard the dreaded name of the Black Douglas. Many years ago in Scotland, there lived a brave knight of legend who was named Sir James of Clan Douglas. Now, Sir James was the firstborn son of one William Douglas, known to many as William the Bold, who himself was a great figure of note in Scottish history, being the first noble to pledge himself to Wallace's rebellion, a cause for which both William the Bold and his son James would one day give their lives for. Due to his cunning and bold military strategies, the young Douglas quickly rose in popularity in Scotland. James would go on to control large parts of the Scottish border, and would frequently raid forth into English land, destroying lightly guarded castles and fortifications, all the while liberating gold and information for the Scottish cause. It was at this time the knight's knowledge of psychological warfare would be put into practice, with each raid sowing fear and despair into the English population. Hushed rumours of the bloodthirsty and mad James Douglas spread like wildfire all over the English border. But meanwhile, in Scotland, the Douglas would acquire a very different public image. There he gained the title Guid Sir James, and was a beacon of knightly chivalry, and the most loyal and steadfast supporter of the new King of Scotland, Robert the Bruce. His reputation was that of a man completely devoted to the cause of Scottish independence, and he was willing to die to defend his country and his people. It was this dedication, along with his military talent, that cemented his place as a grand hero in Scottish history, along with Bruce, Wallace and Murray. Although it is perhaps due to this passionate fury that Guid Sir James received a very different title from the English. For there he was known as the Black Douglas, a hideous bogeyman who at night would creep into towns and castles, slaughtering all who stood in his way. Many of the English soldiers even believed that the Black Douglas was not a mortal man, that he was born of devil or demon, and would appear surrounded in a dense cloud of smoke, with his signature long black hair and beard billowing in the wind, screaming the ancient battle cry, "A Douglas! A Douglas!" moments before a nightmarish horror would descend upon the unsuspecting garrison or town. So fearful were the English of the dreaded Black Douglas that his name would be used by women to admonish their children. If the child would not behave, they were told the Black Douglas would get them. This usually stopped whatever mischief was occurring. And it is within that vein, and with the knowledge of Sir James Douglas, we get on with today's tale. During the early days of the War for Independence, the large Scottish castle of Roxburgh was taken by English forces. This was done in one of the first invasions over the border, and was always seen as a sign of Scottish weakness. So you can imagine just how desperate the Scots were to reclaim that castle and strategic point. Many a force was sent to retake Roxburgh, but alas the defences proved too strong. The Scottish freedom fighters were just about to give up on ever retaking the castle when Guid Sir James arrived and claimed he would return Roxburgh to Scotland. The leadership was unsure what to think, but if anyone could take the castle, it would be the Douglas. Some days later, Gweed Sir James and his men headed to the castle. They had chosen that night in particular, as they knew it was the holiday of Shrovetide, which Roman Catholics paid great respect to, meaning there would be less guards on watch. And this was very much true. For that night, only a few watchmen were left patrolling the ramparts, as the others feasted and celebrated within the castle. As darkness fell, a soldier's wife would walk the battlements, with a small child in her arms. Back and forth she went, trying to soothe the babe, when out of the corner of her eye she noticed movement below in the darkness. The wife did not know what it was, so quickly called a watchman. The guard took one look and said, "Those are nothing to frighten us. They are the farmer's cattle, trying to find their way home. The farmer himself is enjoying the holiday, and must have forgotten to bring them in. But if the Scottish should happen upon the cattle before morning, the farmer will rue his carelessness." With this, the guard returned to his position. Now these creeping dark objects were of course not cattle. They were the Douglas and his men, crawling towards the castle base on all fours, covered in great black cloaks. Behind the men, great wooden ladders were being dragged through the long grass, and soon they would land gently upon the castle wall, and the Douglas began to climb, quietly leading his men onto the battlements. The wife, still with child, was no longer concerned with the loose cattle, and now her attention was taken by the beautiful stars above, and all the while she sang to the child in hushed tones. "Hushye, hushye, little pet ye. Hushye, hushye, do not fret ye. The Black Douglas shall not get ye." The silence was shattered as a gruff voice called from the dark. Did I be so sure of that? Spinning round, the woman now stood face to face with the grim countenance of the Black Douglas. She sat in utter shock as soldier after soldier leapt over the wall, and the battlements were soon covered in Scottish troops. Within minutes, the once quiet castle was filled with a cacophony of metallic clanging and scraping as swords hacked and slashed through the English soldiers, only occasionally overpowered by the deafening cries, "A Douglas! A Douglas!" Soon the English were defeated. Many lay dead, and more yet surrendered, as the Black Douglas took mastery of the great castle of Roxburgh. As for the woman and the child, they were spared, along with all the other women, children, and servants. For it was said that the Black Douglas would not suffer anyone to harm those who were not fighting men. The survivors of Douglas's raid were sent homeward at the rising dawn, filled with more horrific tales of the dreaded Black Douglas and his ferocity in battle. We are unsure if the woman continued to sing her lullaby upon her return to England, but what we do know is that James Douglas had firmly secured his place in Scottish legend. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to my wonderful patrons who help keep these tales alive. This is a somewhat strange tale of the Black Douglas, but it is perhaps more truth than you would first realise. The only reference to this story in particular, and by that I mean one which included the rhyme sang by the English wife, can be found in Sir Walter Scott's Tales of a Grandfather, Volume 1, and this seems to be a semi-fictional account of the Scottish Wars for Independence. Much of the timeline and the important battles and political changes are completely true, but interspersed with these more stylized or fictitious folk tales. Although it would come as no surprise to me that this story was in fact much older than Scott, and may have been a well-known legend surrounding the Black Douglas, much like the tale of the Three Arrows or Bruce and the Spider. What is true about this tale is that on the night of February the 19th, 1314, Roxburgh Castle was taken from the English by Sir James Douglas. His men wore thick black cloaks, and were mistaken by the guards for cattle. Then, using rope and ladders, the Douglas and his men stormed Roxburgh Castle and quickly recaptured it from the English. Robert the Bruce would then order the castle be demolished so that it would never again fall into the hands of the English, although this wouldn't happen for some time yet. The truth or heart of this tale was that James Douglas was an incredibly respected and proficient military commander, feared by the English and loved by his people. But perhaps it is possible that on that night there was a young woman singing of the Black Douglas to her child, and maybe she was interrupted by the very man himself. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you will join me again for more tales of Scottish folklore. Slán